Good morning, and welcome to another episode in our Facebook Live series. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. During each program, we explore an aspect of Holocaust history and its relevance in our world today. Here in the United States, the month of March is Women's History Month, and today we'll be discussing stories of the spies they never saw coming. Performer Josephine Baker was the toast of wartime Paris. Virginia Hall, a wealthy young woman from the American city of Baltimore, had lost a leg in a hunting accident. And Noor Khan was a Muslim pacifist. The three of them were the most unlikely spies, all working in the dangerous environment of German-occupied France. Please join me in welcoming today's guests. Janelle N. is the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency Museum. And Elizabeth Baer is Professor of Holocaust Studies at Gustavus Adolphus College, as well as a volunteer in our museum's Senior Historian's Office. Hi, Janelle. Hi, Elizabeth. We're so glad that you're here.
Good morning.
During today's show, please send us your questions in the comment section, and we'll get to as many of them live as we can. And Janelle, let's begin with a woman who grew up not so far from us here in Baltimore, Maryland, Virginia Hall. Virginia had a significant physical disability as the result of an accident. How did she become a spy against the odds?
To really understand how someone like Virginia Hall became a spy and why she was so effective and successful at it, I think you really need to go back to her youth, how she grew up. This was a woman who, from a very young age, didn't fall to the trappings of societal norms. Virginia Hall definitely knew who she wanted to be and what she wanted out of life. You need courage to be a spy, and Virginia Hall was courageous throughout her entire life. She was born in Baltimore, as you mentioned, to an affluent family, and having a little bit of wealth actually allowed her to have experiences that came in handy later in life while she was serving during World War II. She was able to travel with her family abroad and study. She studied in France, she studied in Paris and Vienna. While she was there, obviously, she was able to learn the language and became fluent in it. But more importantly, when you spend a significant amount of time in a country, you really get to understand their culture. And when you're going to go in undercover, having an idea of what are cultural norms in a specific city or country is very helpful. It's very useful. This made her more effective in the field. And Virginia always knew she wanted to be overseas and have adventure. And so she wanted to be a foreign service officer. That was her dream. She decided to apply to the State Department, and she became a clerk in multiple cities overseas. While she was stationed in Turkey, though, she had a hunting accident. Virginia, growing up, again, a little different than most young girls, her father actually taught her how to shoot weapons. She knew how to shoot guns and would hunt on her family farm. And so when she was in Turkey, she was hunting and she tripped and she accidentally shot the lower part of her leg near her foot. And unfortunately, by the time they got her to the hospital, gangrene had set in and it had to be amputated from the knee down. And so now Virginia has a prosthetic, but again, this is Virginia Hall. She's not going to let that stop her and stand in her way, to the point where she actually accepted this and she named her prosthetic Cuthbert, and it sort of became her lifelong companion. But this wasn't going to stop Virginia, right? So she went back to working for the State Department and wanted to be a Foreign Service officer still. But unfortunately, at that point in history, the State Department had a rule that if you were missing a major limb, they would not accept you into the Foreign Service. And so knowing this, Virginia, she decided to quit and she went to France on her own. She wanted to be a part of the action. She wanted to help the people of France, who she cared about very deeply. And so she became an ambulance driver during the beginning of the war, which was a very rough job. And when it became too dangerous, she actually fled and went to London, to the UK.
So really a quite audacious spirit, doesn't take no for an answer.
Correct. She was the exact right person at the exact right time. She was a woman, so they could use the Nazis' sexism sort of to stay under the radar. As I mentioned, she spoke French fluently and German fluently, and she had just been in France. And so she was going to have that ground truth. That's the term we use at the CIA, where you understand exactly what's going on in a certain place at a certain time.
And she is, in fact, eventually recruited by the British. She's in London, and they recognize that she has this unique set of skills. Were there limitations giving her missing leg to what she could do as a secret agent?
So Virginia went through all of the intensive training of the Special Operations Executive, which was the British kind of version of the CIA. It was Churchill's secret army. And they put her through everything. And a lot of people actually did not pass this training, but Virginia did. She did hand-to-hand combat training with knives. She shot weapons. They would wake her up actually in the middle of the night and interrogate her in French. They put her face underwater and then would scream at her, trying to see if she would divulge any information or if she would break her cover, if she would start talking in English or forget her name and where she grew up, all of which were important for her cover story. So she went through all of that and managed to pass. The one thing that they spared her was she did not do the jump class. She didn't have to learn how to parachute. And that was because the British knew that they didn't need to sneak Virginia Hall into the country secretly via parachute. They actually wanted to send her in with a paper trail because she was going in as an American journalist for the New York Post. And so she was able to get in. She could go by train or plane. It didn't matter. They did not have to have her parachute, which was something that really helped her push through this because that was one of the limitations she would have had with her prosthetic. This training, it was so important to her success because unlike a lot of other spies, she was in France for 15 months for the British and then almost another year for the Americans. And so while she's there, she's recruiting this incredibly diverse set of people to work with her. She's recruiting prostitutes at brothels, nuns at convents, a doctor, and she's looking to these people to help provide lodging for downed pilots or to provide information and cover. And so she's working with these people, and at the same time, she's arming resistance forces. She's scouting drop locations for personnel and supplies, ammunition. And she's also scouting to see where are the pressure points for the Germans, for the Nazis, as far as how are they getting in people and supplies themselves so that they can conduct sabotage missions and blow up bridges, roads, railways, things like that. She really was an outside of the box thinker in so many ways. And when she would help down Allied pilots out of France, which was really important, there was a line that said it's easier to build a new plane essentially than to train an effective pilot. So she would help these pilots get out safely. But while she did that, she made sure to send them back with anything that was of present day. So things like ration books, money, any kind of intelligence, so that they could, actually clothing was really important, so that she could send them back with this pilot so that when new agents came in, they had everything sort of essential to look like their cover and be in a safer situation.
What an exceptional person. I mean, clearly of many, many skills. It sounds like very little, if anything, scared her. There's a line that stuck with me. You mentioned that her cover story or her cover identity was that she was in France as a reporter for the New York Post, and a very recent story from 2018 in the New York Post about her. They said, Virginia Hall did everything that the fictional James Bond would do, except in real life and with one leg. And that is not poetic license. That's just true.
It is.
I want to pause for a second to acknowledge that we have people watching us from all over the country and all over the world. Good morning, and thank you for joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Minnesota. It doesn't tell me what town in Minnesota. Chattanooga, Tennessee, Burlington, Vermont, Roscoe, Illinois, Tallahassee in Florida, Chicago, Phoenix, and Pompano Beach, Florida. And we're also glad to have viewers watching from around the world in London and Oxford in England, and also in Holland. So thank you so much for being with us today. And please do send your questions for Janelle and Elizabeth. The three covert agents that we're discussing today obviously face gender bias, but paradoxically, the low expectations of women in some ways were an advantage. They could weaponize them as a useful form of camouflage. Elizabeth, I'd like to turn to you because this was clearly the case for Noor Khan, another spy operating in wartime France. Tell us about how Noor overcame significant obstacles to become a valuable and courageous wartime agent for the British.
So Noor Khan was born to an American mother and an Indian father in Moscow in 1914. Noor's father was a Sufi mystic. He was a musician and a leader within his form of Islam, and he traveled widely. So they happened to be in Moscow when Noor was born. Her father taught her faith in action as a principle to live by, which is to say, be of service to other. She embraced Gandhi's nonviolence beliefs, And yet she also felt very strongly that fascism must be crushed. And as a result, she volunteered for the British Women's Auxiliary Air Force and was trained in that program in 1940. And in 1942, the British decided to recruit her to become a spy, to learn how to be a radio operator in order to convey messages from France, as it turned out, back to England. And also she learned a lot about airplanes that were bombers, and worked with the pilots for those planes. Some of her trainers were a little dubious about whether she could carry out her work as a spy. They thought she was small of stature when she went through mock interrogations, such as Janelle just mentioned Virginia did. She sometimes froze up, and sometimes she even disclosed personal information. One of her trainers called her clumsy, unsuitable for physical activity, and scared of weapons. Again, unlike Virginia. And they were also worried about her spiritual beliefs, though they served as a source of strength for her. They felt that it might prevent her from making the kind of quick and courageous decisions that are required in espionage.
But in the end, none of these concerns that you've outlined for us prevented the British from dropping Noor into occupied France in 1943 to gather intelligence on the Germans. What did she do there? And did she make it? What was her fate? This was very dangerous.
Indeed. So June 1943, she's flown into an airfield in the country in France, takes the train to Paris, gets to a safe house. She's always carrying her leather suitcase, which contained her radio messaging equipment. And she had developed what was called a good fist, because this is how you would operate the radio messaging system. She went undercover. Her code name was Madeline. And she both conveyed crucial information back to England and organized spy rings within Paris. She survived a series of mass arrests that the Nazis made shortly after she arrived, and the British called her back to London. They felt that it was no longer safe for her to be in France, but she refused. She continued her radio transmission work and continued organizing crucial missions within France. So despite the fact that the average amount of time that a radio operator would survive in occupied France before being arrested by the Gestapo was only 6 weeks, Noor lasted for 4 months in France.
Really extraordinary. And she was only 29 years old, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Brave person. We have an audience question. Judy from Facebook is asking whether Noor survived the war.
Thank you for that question. Sadly, no. There's a long list of women spies. The other two women we're talking about today, Virginia Hall and Josephine Baker, both survived. Vera Atkins, a very famous spy in the war, survived, but sadly Noor did not. And here's the story of what happened to her. She was betrayed by a double agent, essentially a woman who was contacted the Gestapo and said they knew how to find Noor, and she demanded a large sum of money, and the Gestapo paid her that money, and she betrayed Noor. She was arrested in her apartment. She was taken initially to a very posh Nazi prison on 84 Folk Avenue in Paris, where she was treated well and interrogated, but never disclosed any information. She tried to escape twice. When the Nazis arrested her, they managed to find her code book and her radio transmitter in the apartment, and this proved to be very bad, because once they had those two things, they could continue to send transmissions to England as if they were Noor, using the codes and her radio equipment. And in this way, they got responses from England with lots of confidential information, which enabled them to arrest other people. After Noor tried to escape twice, she was put on a train and sent to a much more secure prison, Forsheim in Germany. And because she was seen as an escape risk, she was bound with chains on her hands and her feet. And she languished in isolation in the prison for about 10 months. And then with a couple of other women operatives, taken to Dachau and executed by a gunshot to the head. It is said that her last word was liberté, which means freedom in French, and she was only 30 years old when she died.
What an absolutely heroic figure. I had not heard of her before we prepped for this show, and she made the ultimate sacrifice by giving her life to defend people outside of herself, really selfless and brave. Janelle, Virginia was also in danger after her network was breached. I've heard that Klaus Barbie, the notorious butcher of Lyon, he was the Gestapo chief in the French city of Lyon, actually became quite obsessed with her and capturing her. How did Virginia Hall come to his attention?
Because she was really good at her job. Sometimes when you're very successful, you unfortunately draw unwanted attention. And the fact that a woman was disrupting Barbie's plans definitely wasn't setting well with him. The fact that a woman could be so effective. And so he essentially became obsessed with her, and there were wanted posters all over the area with a drawing or a likeness of Virginia Hall. And she became the most wanted woman in the country. He referred to her as the limping lady, something that she really was bothered by. She thought that over the course of many years, she had hidden her limp. And so probably knowing what I have gained knowledge about Virginia over the years, that probably lit another fire inside of her, the fact that he referred to her as the limping lady. But it was too dangerous to stay in France. Besides Klaus Barbie coming after her, she also needed to figure out what to do with the people in her ring or her network that started going missing. Unfortunately, just like Noor, Virginia was betrayed by a double agent. It was a priest by the name of Abby Ailish. He had infiltrated her ring, and it was something that she was very upset about because she was really good at reading people and did not trust him from the beginning and sent communication all the way back to SOE headquarters. And they said that he was to be trusted. And it turned out that he was actually the reason that all of her ring was getting dismantled and her people started going missing and were being sent to prison. So she knew she needed to get out of the country, and she needed to do it fast. And given what was happening, she had to find a way of doing that without taking a train or getting on an airplane.
And so I think this dovetails nicely with a question that we have from a viewer named Pat. Pat asks, and Pat says she always wanted to be a spy, and she wants to know what Virginia's scariest time and place were while on a mission. I think what came next probably would be up there, right?
Correct. So everything that I have read or people I've spoken with who knew Virginia, they said that she wrote that her hike over the Pyrenees, which was what her escape route was to flee France, was the only time she truly felt vulnerable doing her work. She had to flee France in November. So this isn't hiking through the Pyrenees in nice weather. This is hiking through the Pyrenees sometimes when there's 3 feet of snow, which is going to be hard for any able-bodied person. But again, Virginia has a prosthetic leg. And so when you walk through snow, you usually have to kind of pick your leg up and over. And she wasn't able to do this. And so she actually had to sort of drag her leg behind her. By the time they were able to get to a safe house, her stump, so the edge of where her real leg met the prosthetic, she would wear a sock to protect it from friction. She was bleeding, she had blisters. And so the woman at the safe house actually gave her a new sock. But being Women's History Month, I will say that she wrote that the men were complaining more than she was. But it was truly the time that she felt the most vulnerable and scared that she might not make it. She trekked for 2 days and ascended 8,000 feet over the Pyrenees and into Spain. When she was at the safe house, she actually made a communication saying that Cuthbert was giving her trouble. And so the British responded back, well, if Cuthbert's giving you trouble, have him eliminated, meaning take him out. They had no idea that Cuthbert wasn't a real person. They didn't know that Virginia Hall had named her leg Cuthbert.
Cuthbert was her prosthetic.
Correct.
And we have a comment from someone on Twitter whose handle is expat mom. She writes, "Thank you for including a woman with a disability. It means a lot. I have medical issues with my right leg, and it is encouraging to read about a woman accomplishing a great deal who had more of a disability than myself." So thank you, expat mom, for that. Clearly, Virginia Hall was not deterred as she made her way to Spain, which was officially neutral. And she walked there over the mountains. Now, Janelle, despite having escaped to safety or relative safety, Virginia didn't stay out of the game long. It wasn't in her nature, it sounds like. How did the Americans come to snap her up as a spy?
When Virginia got back to London, she wanted to go pretty much immediately back into France, but the British said it was far too dangerous. They knew that she was wanted and that people had an understanding of what she looked like. And so they weren't going to let her back in. And again, sort of like the State Department not letting her be a Foreign Service officer, she quit. And she joined the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor to my organization, the CIA. We wanted to send her back in. Obviously, this is, again, a woman with ground truth who had just been in France, but had been very, very successful. So we knew that she had a lot of skills that would help the Allied forces on the American side. But one thing that Virginia did when she got back to the UK is she made a point of telling the British that sending in one wireless radio operator just wasn't a good idea. As we learned with Noor, the Germans are driving around with detection devices, and they're able to find these people and they arrest them, they put them in jail, or they kill them. And so now you've got the rest of your group or your agents that are sort of dead in the water when it comes to certain ways of communicating because your wireless operator is gone. And so when Virginia got back, she really pushed them to train everyone that they were going to send in wireless radio. And so while she was waiting to figure out her next plan, she actually trained in wireless. So this was another thing that the Americans could take advantage of as far as her skills when she went back into France. We did not want to put her in just as Virginia Hall, though. Obviously, that was too dangerous. And so we disguised her as an old woman. And Virginia Hall grew up doing theater, and so she was able to really pull back on her past and truly live all of the aspects of her career. She wore layers of clothing to hide her figure, but she developed a shuffle. One of the things as an actor is when you take on a character, you take on a different gait, a different posture, a different way of walking. And so to hide her limp, she actually created a shuffle that looked similar to something an old woman would have if they had an arthritis in their hip. And so this helped disguise the limp, which we knew they were aware of in France. And she went so far as to actually find a dentist to file down her American dental work and have it look more European. Like, that's intense on a whole different level. But she wanted to make sure that she was exactly what her cover needed to be. And we put her back in by boat, and she was very effective for the Americans, just like she was for the British. Her cover allowed her to take cows from one pasture to the next. And doing this may have drawn attention if you were just looking around without cattle, but she was able to take that cover to scout locations for drops. So personnel, supplies, things like ammunition, explosive devices were being dropped in the dead of night. The explosive devices were really important because one of the things Virginia Hall did very effectively for the Americans was she scouted locations to conduct sabotage operations. Basically, they were blowing up bridges and railroads that the Nazis were using to bring people and supplies in and out of the country. A lot of this was in advance of D-Day. Virginia was actually too important to go on the sabotage missions. I know books and movies have portrayed her there, but everything we've read said that she was too important to lose. And so she would teach them how to use the explosive devices. She would teach the French resistance exactly what they needed to do and where they needed to do it, but she would stay behind for the operations themselves. She also did wireless. So this is important, again, because it's very dangerous, but it just added to this list of what Virginia Hall was doing for the Americans and for the Allied forces. There's a painting in the CIA. We have an intelligence art gallery, and it depicts Virginia Hall in a barn. And you'll see in the picture that she actually has a bicycle. You're probably wondering, what on earth is this bicycle doing? Well, Virginia was so good at thinking outside the box and really looking at a situation that may be very difficult and finding a way to do it. That's something that was important of OSS, of American officers in France, or of CIA officers today. You have to find ways to get things done. And so she needed power. And so she worked to rig up a bicycle to actually power her radio. The entire time she was there, she actually sent over more than 20 communications. Again, very important. But one of the things that people don't realize, because she's so brave and she just comes across as, like you said, like this James Bond type character, is Virginia Hall was actually very scared. She saw awful, very traumatizing things, and she was in danger every moment she was there. She could have been caught at any moment. And so one of the things that I think is the most inspiring is how long she stayed, because she didn't have to, but she cared so much about the French people. And she was just so disgusted by what Nazi Germany was doing that she just kept being focused and stayed with her job until she knew that she had taken on everything that the Allied forces would allow her to do before getting her out.
She really was clearly quite the tactician, a strategic thinker, and her impact was immense. Eventually, she came to head a network of some 1,500 members of the French resistance. So what an exceptional person.
I was just going to say, and again, with being Women's History Month, some of those men had a hard time taking orders from an American woman, but she pretty much told them, if you want weapons, if you want explosive devices, essentially, if you want to win, you need to follow me. And they do have writings from people saying some of the men would have followed Virginia to hell and back. That's how much they trusted her.
Incredible. Elizabeth, we haven't yet talked about the one woman on our list today who I think would be the closest to a household name, very famous performer Josephine Baker. For people who may not know about Josephine Baker, please tell us more, and also what motivated her to become a spy.
So Josephine was born in East St. Louis in 1906 into a family of entertainers, but she grew up in very impoverished situation. By the age of 8, she was performing on the stage, and by the age of 16, she was actually on Broadway. But on Broadway, she wasn't a glamorous figure such as we just saw in the photograph. Instead, she was made to wear oversized clown shoes, to perform in stereotypical ways, to cross her eyes, and really in many ways to perform in a fashion that was demeaning to her. But 3 years later, when she was 19 in 1925, she got the opportunity to go to Paris with an African-American troupe. And it wasn't long before she was an absolute sensation in Paris, the toast of Paris. And yes, occasionally she would wear a banana skirt as part of her act, but she also wore beautiful satin dresses and sequins and glittering jewels. She would sometimes change clothing 12 times in one of her acts. She was recruited to become a spy by a member of the French espionage, Jacques Abté, in 1939, right at the beginning of the war. And when he approached her, she had no hesitation. She said, "The Parisians have given me their heart, and I am willing to give them my life." And she remained steadfast as a member of the espionage rings in France and Portugal until the end of the war. The Nazis saw Josephine Baker as a racial threat. She was not only African American, but she was openly bisexual. And she was also by this time married to her third husband, who was a Jewish man. So in 1940, in June 1940, when the Nazis occupied Paris, she knew that she had to leave. She could be arrested just on the basis of being a Black woman. And she put her several pets and a couple of Belgian refugees into a car and headed out of Paris with a huge train of cars that were French people leaving the capital. And Josephine, being Josephine, she knew she would need extra gasoline along the way. She was smart. She kept her head in emergencies. And so she filled champagne bottles with gasoline to disguise what they were and made it safely to her chateau in the south of France. She rightly perceived Nazi ideology as a racist ideology, and this was one of her strongest motivations for becoming a spy.
And indeed, as you just described, Josephine quite literally embodied what the Nazis labeled as degenerate in their worldview. After the German occupation of France in 1940, she would vow not to sing until France was freed. But I think we should have a listen to her extraordinary voice. We have a clip of Josephine entertaining troops, and she galvanized so many French people, gave them hope and inspiration. Let's have a listen.
Wonderful. So we can see the adoration of the French soldiers on their faces there, and she is singing what became her signature song. Translated into English, it says, "I have two loves, deux amours, my country, America, and Paris and the French." So she had this double love. And you can see how easily, how fluidly she moves on the stage. She was invited to parties, to after theater events, to the Italian and the Japanese embassies. And so it was very easy for her to innocently ask leading questions of the Nazis whom she encountered in these situations. And she would actually write on her hands and her arms the information that they gave her, which she could then convey to Jacques Abtey, which then ultimately went on to the British. The Germans radically underestimated Josephine Baker. They just saw her as a woman of color, someone who was very low on the racial hierarchy that the Nazis established, with Aryans at the top and Jews at the bottom. And so she was a very valuable spy.
But she was able to exploit this underestimation to her advantage. Nevertheless, she had a big limitation in that she was very easily recognizable, probably one of the most famous people in Paris. While Virginia and Noor were undercover, clearly not an option for Josephine. How was she able to operate in plain sight?
Yes, it does seem kind of counterintuitive to think that she had this double identity when she was so well known. But in fact, her celebrity status made everybody eager to meet her and talk with her. And in this way, she was able to gather a lot of information. There came a moment when she and Jacques needed to convey all of this information that she had gathered back to the British. And what they did was to devise a tour to Portugal with Jacques Abtey disguising himself as her ballet master. Josephine took all the information she'd gathered. She wrote it on invisible ink on the back of her music sheets and on the back of photographs that had been taken of installations and so forth, which she hid in her clothing. And again, because of her celebrity status, she just waltzed across the border. She was not searched by the Nazis guards at the border because they assumed that she was, again, just an entertainer and didn't have a brain in her head. So she was very successful in this Portuguese mission, and the documents got transferred to the British.
What else made Josephine's efforts so unusual? It wasn't just that she was able to get away with not being searched or that people would be loose-lipped around her, but she did a tremendous amount of really important work, right?
Absolutely. So, despite the fact that after World War II, a lot of people in France claimed that they'd been involved in the resistance, in fact, only about 2% of the French were involved in the resistance. Others were bystanders or collaborators. And so I think it's telling that the two American women we've talked about this morning, Virginia Hall and Josephine Baker, devoted themselves to spying in France because of their love of France and the French people, and both were highly successful. She raised more than 3 million francs for the Free French Army through entertainment and tapping wealthy people that she knew. And her bravery was honored by an appointment to the Women's Auxiliary of the French Air Force. And she was given a uniform with various decorations, which she wore for the rest of her life very, very proudly. It was almost a form of French citizenship for her. After the liberation of Paris in 1944, Josephine became aware that many people in Paris were suffering because of food shortages and coal shortages. She took many of her valuable possessions, her jewelry, and sold it in order to get money to provide food and coal to the citizens of Paris. So a very selfless gesture after all the other work that she had done successfully as a spy.
Not only a very, very courageous person, but a true humanitarian. Clearly, her heart was in everything. We have a number of questions coming in from viewers. A comment from someone named Merle. Merle writes, "This program reminds me of the story of the old worthless," and I think she means seemingly worthless, "women who knitted in plain sight, knitting intelligence in their garments, and the Nazis had no idea." Merle, this is not something that's familiar to me. I can't say if it's true or not. Janelle, does this ring any bells for you?
It doesn't. I know that during the Revolutionary War, we have evidence that women were quilting and would use the little quilting groups they had to sort of listen in on things. And actually at the CIA now, we have a group of people who make quilts. They're called the undercover quilters, in honor sort of what women were doing during both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War.
And along those lines, since you've mentioned some of your female colleagues, a woman named Melanie writes in to ask, how does the work of these women help the women spies of today? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, I think the legacy of Virginia Hall is incredibly strong at the CIA in present day. She's an inspiration to so many female officers, especially in the Directorate of Operations, because Virginia Hall was the first paramilitary CIA officer in our history. And that's a really big deal. One of the things that I think people don't realize is how much the women who come before the present day really matter as far as, breaking the glass ceiling. And in the case of Virginia Hall, she really created the foundation on which our current female leaders now stand. In 2020, we had pretty much made history. We had our first female director, and every single directorate within our entire organization was led by a woman. And I don't think we could have done that without people like Virginia Hall.
Was she formally recognized for her achievements later in life?
She was awarded by both the British and the French. But here in the United States, she became the most highly decorated American female civilian of World War II when she received the Distinguished Service Cross. In this picture, you'll see that General Donovan, who was the head of the Office of Strategic Services, is giving it to her. And that's because in true Virginia Hall fashion, she actually said no to the President of the United States. And I love that about her. The president wanted to give Virginia Hall the Distinguished Service Cross at the White House, but she wanted to stay in the shadows. She wanted to remain sort of anonymous in case she ever had an opportunity to work in a covert world again. And so she said no, and instead asked that Donovan give the award to her in her office with only her mother basically present. That was the only person she invited. And that really played to Virginia's advantage. She wasn't a person with an ego or wanting attention. And because of that, she was able to still work in a covert world when she came to the CIA.
So she was an agent, a spy, or at least in that mindset till the end.
Correct. She stayed with the CIA until mandatory retirement age, and I have a feeling she would have stayed longer if they had let her.
Amazing. Elizabeth, what about Josephine Baker? What happened to her after the war?
Actually, both Noor and Josephine were awarded significant civilian awards by France and England. Of course, Noor, it was posthumous for her. And Baker wore her French Air Force uniform to the March on Washington in 1963, where she was one of the few women to speak from the podium. I think it's worth noting that these two women, Noor and Josephine, both women of color, broke barriers, resisting Nazi ideology, which is an ideology of racism and hatred. They brought dedication to their adopted country and to the power of love. Both of them believe very strongly in the power of love. And I think it's also worth noting they were both immigrants to France who made an enormous difference for that country, which is a lesson for our global community with the refugees and immigrants today.
And we have a question about Noor from a viewer named Brian. He said that Noor hoped her service would aid and help in Indian pride. Has that been the case? Has her Indian heritage been embraced her heroism?
Yes, thank you, Brian, for that question. Sad to say, Noor was ignored in her country for many years after her death. In the early 21st century, some recognition began to come through the Indian government, but Hindu nationalism has prevented proper recognition of her.
Nonetheless, she is honored in England with her official honors and with a bust that we're seeing here, right, that was unveiled in 2012. Posthumously recognizing her contribution to the British war effort. We have a viewer named Alexandria, who is a graduate of the same Baltimore school that Virginia Hall attended, Roland Park Country School, and she writes on Facebook, Virginia could have had such a cushy life of privilege had she just stayed home. Virginia can indeed be proud. And I think that's true of all three of these women. You know, this is something they opted to do. They did not need to. And it just adds to the sense of awe and gratitude that we have. Jeffrey from Massachusetts writes to ask, where is the CIA museum located and is it open to the public?
That's my favorite question. So the CIA museum, unfortunately, is not open to the public because it is located inside our headquarters building, which has guards and other things and you can't get in. But what we do at the CIA Museum is we really try to get our collection out to the public via our website. So the CIA.gov website has a really great collection of our artifacts that you can go in and learn more about. And then we also partner with our Office of Public Affairs at the CIA, and we do Artifact of the Week, and we use Twitter and Facebook and things of that nature so that the collection can come alive to people in the public.
That's great. We hope that you will check that out and research all three of these women. In closing, Kimberly from Farmington, Connecticut. Oh, wait, not in closing. First, I want to give a special thanks to Lorna Catling, who is Virginia Hall's niece, who gave us permission to use these photographs of Virginia today. And thank you also to Peggy in France for acquiring the video footage of Josephine that we used in today's program. Now, Kimberly from Farmington, Connecticut has written to say, thank you so much for this conversation. Learning about powerful, courageous women from these powerful and knowledgeable female hosts is so empowering, truly inspiring. And I have to agree that I was inspired. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Janelle, so much for being here and teaching us today.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
We hope we've just piqued your curiosity by giving you a glimpse into these little-known stories of extraordinary women who refuse to be deterred by limitations, whether imposed on the basis of their sex, their skin color, religion, or physical disability. They were able to transform low expectations into a strategic advantage in order to mask their work as spies, risking their lives to help defeat Nazi Germany. We hope you will join us in 2 weeks next week. Right? No, in 2 weeks for our next Facebook Live program at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time for a show about young Americans. How did young Americans respond to the Nazi threat? In that show, we will talk about the many ways that young people, students, and young adults in the United States spoke out and acted in response to what they were hearing about the persecution of Europe's Jews. Until then, wherever you are, be safe and be well. Take care.